March 1974, when Lieutenant Hiro Onoda finally walked out of the Philippine jungle 29 years after the end of World War II.
I'd like to get my hands on that game.
You mean you haven't played yet? We can play it on my Nintendo Entertainment System.
One lane opens up, no one closes down. You've got to get to Michael sooner. You let him get inside the foul line here.
Give me a mark. Mark gets ready. Roger out.
Robert Eric Wone is a name that has not only kept many up at night, but has also basked in the unforeseen space of mystery for over 16 years. The events that transpired on August 2nd, 2006 are still debated to this day, and the frustrating lack of any resolution has led to YouTubers, podcasters, and even major networks covering extensively into what exactly happened that night, and in hopes that someday there will be justice for the young man who was described as a sweet, caring, and hard-working individual. To understand everything, let me take you back to the night it all started. On August 2nd, 2006, after a long night of working, Robert Eric Wone stayed the night at the home of his friend from college, Joseph Price. Price lived there with his partner, Victor Zaborski, as well as Dylan Ward. Joseph, Victor, and Dylan were in a polyamorous relationship. Joseph was aware that Robert would be staying that night due to him working late and him not wanting to go home to possibly wake up his wife. According to Joseph, things were pretty normal for that evening, and shortly after Robert arrived, he went upstairs to get ready for bed. Robert had arrived at Joseph's near 10:30 p.m., and a little over 30 minutes later, around 11, neighbors reported hearing screaming coming from the house, and were sure that their recollection of the time was correct due to them watching the 11 o'clock news when they heard the scream. It was later discovered that the scream came from Victor, and less than an hour later, at 11:49 p.m., a phone call was made to 911.
DC Emergency 911 Operator 6752. Do you need police, fire, or ambulance?
Immediately. We need an ambulance.
What's wrong, ma'am?
We had someone that was in our house, evidently, and they stabbed somebody.
Okay, somebody's inside the house now?
I don't know. We heard.
Are they bleeding? You see someone bleeding?
Someone is bleeding in our house.
Okay, where's they bleeding from?
I think in the stomach.
In the stomach? Is he cautious? Calm down for me. I'm going to send some help, okay? Female or male?
It's a male. He's a friend of ours. He was spending the night with us.
Okay, and who was the person that stabbed him? Do you know? Is he conscious?
We need an ambulance.
Ma'am, listen to me.
He's not conscious.
He's not conscious at all?
No. We need someone right now.
Is he breathing? Listen to me. Calm down. I'm going to help you, okay? Is he breathing?
I'm upstairs, and he's downstairs. I don't know.
Okay, who's downstairs with him?
My partner is downstairs with him right now. He told me to go upstairs and call the police immediately. I just went to the stairs.
Okay, who's the person? Okay, I'm sending paramedics and the police. Okay, who's the person that stabbed him?
I don't know. We think it's somebody with an intruder in the house. We heard the chime at the door.
And it's 15, ma'am, calm down. 1509 Swan Street, Northwest. Am I correct?
Yes, it is.
The person that stabbed him, is he still in the home?
I don't know.
We got help en route, okay?
Pardon me?
We have help en route.
Thank you. They're here.
They are en route to you now. I'm sending the police and the paramedics, okay, to assist. Okay, what I need you to do is go downstairs, okay? the place wherever he was stabbed at, I need you to get a dry cloth, okay? And just apply pressure to that area. If he was, wherever he was stabbed at on his body, I need you to take a towel downstairs while you're waiting for the paramedics to arrive and just apply pressure. Even if the rag or towel is saturated with blood, just get another towel and put it on top, but never lift the first towel off the area. Hold it on. Once it gets filled up with blood, just put another towel on top of that and just apply pressure until the paramedics arrive. Yes.
On the leg.
Yeah.
The stab in the heart.
In the heart?
Yes. In the center of his chest.
Okay. Is he breathing?
Is he breathing?
We have help en route now, okay? You don't know who it was?
No idea. So don't touch this.
Okay, is he breathing?
He's breathing, but he needs help now.
Okay, we have help en route, ma'am, okay? We do have help en route. Okay, just go down there and try to tell your husband or your the other half to just try to keep him calm and talk to him, okay?
6 minutes later, EMTs, along with several police officers, arrived at the house and began working on saving Robert. When they entered the bedroom that he was staying in, Robert was found to be sitting upright in the bed and suspiciously appeared to have recently showered, as his body and hair were still damp. Robert had been stabbed 3 times in the chest, and yet there was very little blood in his bedroom and barely any on him. EMTs quickly rushed Robert out of the house and transported him to a nearby hospital. On the way there, an EMT noticed that there had been puncture wounds on his arm that hadn't been made by medical personnel. Shortly after arriving to the hospital, Robert Eric Wone was pronounced dead at 12:24 a.m., and the subsequent investigation into his death would create a seemingly never-ending trail of questions and very little answers. Immediately after his death, an investigation began, and the first people that police wanted to talk to were the 3 others that were in the house with Robert. And from the start, things appeared unusual, which unfortunately would be a running theme throughout this entire case. When police interviewed Joseph, Victor, and Dylan, the 3 men appeared to have all recently showered, and they all appeared incredibly calm given the situation. It was also noted from the EMTs that when they had arrived at the house, that none of the men showed them where Robert was, and when police examined the bedroom, very little evidence had been discovered. The biggest and arguably most important evidence found from the crime scene was a knife that had been smeared with blood. Yet that would be a problem in and of itself, but I will come back to that later. From the initial investigation, Joseph, Victor, and Dylan all told police the same story, that they had heard a series of grunts coming from Robert's room, and when Victor went to check, he heard footsteps going down the stairs, but he never saw anyone. When Victor opened the door to the bedroom was then when he discovered Robert. They then assumed that an intruder had broken in. The 3 men speculated that the intruder could have hopped the fence in their backyard and gained entry into the back door, which was left unlocked. All 3 men stated that they never saw anyone, nor did they hear anyone coming up the stairs. But something police found suspicious is that if there was an intruder, then this person would have had to have walked right past Joseph's bedroom to get to the guest room that Robert was in. Something that didn't make a lot of sense to investigators. The police ended up disregarding the men's story altogether due to a lack of evidence to support their theory of the events. Another red flag for the police was not only due to all 3 men and Robert having showered recently, but when a cadaver dog got a hit from a dryer lint trap and a patio drain, investigators began to theorize that one of the men had washed themselves off on the back patio and then threw their clothes into the dryer. Then, going back to the knife that was found in the bedroom, police actually suspected that the knife was staged due to the lack of blood in the bedroom, yet the overwhelming amount of blood on the knife. Also, the wound patterns found on Robert didn't fully match that of the knife in the bedroom. Yet, a knife was actually missing from a set that Dylan had kept in his bedroom, and that knife would have been much more consistent with the injuries to Robert. Robert's autopsy showed that he did suffer a degree of suffocation, and that it could have been from a pillow, but ultimately it was the 3 stab wounds to his chest that were the cause of death. But what was found from the autopsy was that there were no signs of defensive wounds on Robert. There was also no evidence of him being restrained, and when his body was discovered, his arms were by his side. But what was found that was also noticed by the EMTs earlier were that there were several puncture wounds on his neck, foot, hand, and chest. Yet frustratingly, after a toxicology report was done, no drugs or toxins had been found. But the police, and many who have read this story, think that there had to be some kind of paralyzing agent injected into Robert that made him helpless to defend himself. I mean, why else, or more so, how else does someone get stabbed multiple times in the chest to then have very little blood around them and no defensive marks on their body? This is exactly one of the many things that has happened with this case that has made it incredibly difficult to solve. Another interesting thing to note is that 3 months after the murder, the brother of Joseph, Michael Price, broke into the same house and, along with an accomplice, stole over $7,000 worth of valuables. The two were arrested and the charges were ultimately dropped, but the interesting thing to note is that shortly before the burglary happened, police were actually preparing to make an arrest in connection with Robert's case. This was revealed in 2007, stating that the burglary case impacted the arrest that was going to be made. And since then, it has never been publicly said as to who was going to be arrested and what the charges were going to be. And as frustrating as that is, it seems to fit in well with this case, as the overwhelming theme of it is just that, frustrating. And Robert's widow experienced this more than anyone. It appeared that she had continued fighting for resolution, doing interviews with various news agencies expressing her frustration at the lack of any progress and how it had not only been a trying time for herself, but also the families who have been living with no answers or justice for what had happened to Robert. There, however, was some movement in the case in October of 2008. 2 years after the crime, Joseph, Victor, and Dylan were all charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy, as well as possible future charges of evidence tampering. It all boiled down to investigators not believing that the men didn't play a part in the crime or thereafter. The report on the charges stated that Robert was restrained, incapacitated, assaulted, and murdered in the home, and that the three men either played a part directly in those events or by lying to authorities or altering the crime scene. So much so that the report actually stated the evidence was so overwhelming that it was more fitting to be probable cause. The men's lawyers argued that it was all speculation and assumption due to the lack of any actual evidence. And this went back and forth for nearly 2 years. And in June of 2010, the three men were found not guilty on any charges. And to this day, nobody has been charged in the death of Robert Eric Wone. Because of the lack of any conclusion, many have speculated and theorized about what could have happened. While many point to the obvious that Joseph, Victor, and Dylan had a part to play in the crime, others have put forth other theories, stating that it could have actually been an intruder, arguing that if someone had broken in and heard three men in one room, they may have snuck past that bedroom to loot the rest of the house, unaware that Robert was in the guest room sleeping. If a TV or music were playing, then that could have masked the sounds of potential fighting, if there even were any. It also has to be addressed that not many burglars walk around with paralyzing agents on their person to subdue occupants, so that in and of itself is something that honestly can't be ignored. The puncture wounds, at least to me, are the biggest red flag. Robert had no history of drug use, and for him to have no defensive wounds makes it seem highly suspicious that he was indeed injected with something that caused him not to be able to defend himself. Another theory is that if it were Joseph, Victor, and Dylan behind this attack, many wondered why. Joseph and Robert were very close friends and had known each other for years. Some have actually speculated that Robert was possibly in a romantic or intimate relationship with Joseph, and that night was planned for both of them to have an evening together. But things got out of hand. A lot of this case was actually viewed by many as sexual in nature, and if that were the case, then was it a consensual act occurring? And unfortunately, things got carried away so badly that it ended with a man losing his life. Or was this a forceful act, and those responsible knew they would have to keep Robert quiet to avoid any possible ramifications? The perplexing thing that I am going to end this on is that if all three men were in fact responsible, none of them flipped on each other. And you do see this all the time when there are multiple people involved in a crime. Police can usually get someone to tell the whole story for a lesser jail sentence, or complete immunity in some cases. On top of that, none of them gave conflicting stories, and while sure they could have come up with the story and made sure they all knew it front to back, it is strange that none of them slipped up on any detail, no matter how small. I am not saying that Joseph, Victor, or Dylan is responsible for what happened to Robert, but I am saying that it is very tough to ignore the facts. That three grown men were just a few feet away when one of their friends was being brutally assaulted and murdered, and that no one has any answers. Today's video is sponsored by HelloFresh. In today's busy world, many of us have a tough time juggling all of the responsibilities of life. When you throw in grocery shopping to that, it makes sense why so many of us just decide to order takeout for our meals, while ignoring the fact that we are severely overpaying with all of those delivery fees. Add on top of that the fact that a lot of the food that we buy from grocery stores ends up going to waste, we might as well just be throwing our money in the trash. But luckily, today's sponsor HelloFresh has stepped in to put a stop to the never-ending cycle of grocery shopping. HelloFresh makes mealtime easy with delicious recipes made with fresh, wholesome ingredients delivered right to your door. No lines, no hassle, just great tasting meals that you can whip up and enjoy in the comfort of home. HelloFresh also doesn't want your meal going to waste, which is why they take care of the meal planning and prepping with pre-portioned ingredients, foolproof recipes, and convenient doorstep delivery, helping you focus on getting dinner on the table. And if you are worried about freshness, there's no need. HelloFresh makes sure you are getting seasonal ingredients picked at peak ripeness for quality that you can taste. Ingredients travel from the farm to your home in less than 7 days, so you know they are fresh. Seriously, I have been using HelloFresh for a while now, and it has drastically helped me not only budget my time so much better because I am not grocery shopping several times a week, but the food really does taste better. I've even gotten several of my friends and family members to switch over to HelloFresh before they ever reached out to the channel. So if you want to start experiencing a different way to eat, go to HelloFresh.com and use code Cadaver50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com and use code Cadaver50 for 50% off plus free shipping. Thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring today's video. There are few cases that I can actually say have bothered me so much that I actually lost sleep over them. This case, however, is one of, if not the most disturbing case I have read about in not only my career on YouTube, but also since I have been a fan of true crime as a whole. The Dardeen family case is still one that haunts many around the state of Illinois. And what was left in the aftermath were things that many in law enforcement didn't think to be possible for a human being to inflict on another. I am going to say a warning here that this story is not for the faint of heart, and if you are in any way squeamish or easily upset about crimes involving kids, then I would advise you to skip to the timestamp on screen now. For those who have chosen to stay, let us begin our story about the horrors of the Dardeen family. The story begins in 1987 in Ina, Illinois. The Dardeen family consisted of Keith, his wife Elaine, and their 3-year-old son Peter. Elaine and Keith were expecting to add another member to their family as she was 7 months pregnant. The family, for the most part, had a happy and pretty normal life. Keith was a treatment plant operator and Elaine worked at an office supply store. Religion was also a large part of the family's life. Both Keith and Elaine were involved in their local church, Keith being a lead vocalist for a small church band, and Elaine played the piano. The family were noted by the locals as nice and friendly people with a bright future ahead of them. The only trouble that had seemingly been in the family's life was that the area that they lived in had recently seen a spike in violent attacks, as in the prior 2 years there had been a reported 14 homicides in the county that they lived in. This rise in crime had caused many in the area to be more on edge than normal, and even Keith had grown paranoid of the off chance that his family could potentially become victims themselves. Keith was actively looking to move both he and his family out of the area due to this, and according to his mother, grew even more stressed when one particular crime that involved a 10-year-old girl being murdered less than 10 miles away from where they lived. It had gotten so bad for Keith that one night it was reported that Keith refused to open the door to a young woman knocking in the middle of the night, asking if she could use their phone. Keith kept the door locked and refused to let her in or to use their phone. It was something that he wouldn't risk, and honestly, I can't say I fault him for this. While the panic in Keith was growing, it was thought that in the next year or so the family would have moved to a better area. Unfortunately, this would never happen, as the Dardeens' worries became a reality. On November 18, 1987, Keith failed to show up for work. Finding this very out of character for Keith, his boss called his house, and when nobody answered, some concern grew. But people figured that something else could have happened, such as a family emergency. His boss was able to later get in contact with Keith's parents, and neither of them had neither heard nor seen their son that afternoon nor the day prior. With the knowledge of what Keith had told his parents about the area, Keith's father contacted the sheriff's office, and both he and an officer made their way to the Dardeens' residence. When they arrived, they noticed that Keith's car was gone, yet Elaine's was still in the driveway. Knocking on the door and not getting an answer, officers made their way inside the home and noticed nothing out of place at first. As they began to scan the home room by room, they eventually came across the master bedroom, and to their horror, saw a scene of carnage that no doubt scarred those officers for the rest of their careers. What was seen were the horribly beaten and bloodied bodies of both Elaine and Peter. Some of the injuries that were inflicted, I flat out cannot say on YouTube, but what I can say is that Elaine was bound and gagged with duct tape and had severe injuries to her skull and torso. Peter suffered similar wounds. And if that wasn't bad enough, what officers were able to make out shortly after the initial discovery was that Elaine had apparently been beaten so severely that it forced her into labor, and her daughter was born right there in the bed amongst the chaos that was taking place, and horrifically met with the same fate as her brother and mother. After the shock of what was seen, the house was thoroughly searched, and one thing that was missing that I brushed on minutes ago was both Keith and his car. Police now saw Keith as their primary suspect, and a search was immediately started. His mother's house was raided by police, but Keith was not there. The entire county seemed to be in lockdown with police and investigators searching for Keith. Later in the afternoon, Keith's car was located outside of a police station of all places, with blood covering much of the interior. And shortly after that discovery, a pair of hunters stumbled upon the body of Keith Dardeen. He had been shot 3 times at close range, as well as having his genitals mutilated. The entire Dardeen family had been annihilated, and the aftermath of the crime would send the residents of Ina, Illinois into an almost crazed panic. The effect that this crime had on the locals had almost instant repercussions. Many in the town began to open carry even when simply going to get gas. Students were required to wait in the gym after school for their parents instead of waiting outside. A man who was a neighbor of the Dardeens was under so much stress from what happened that he reportedly didn't sleep for several days and ended up losing 15 pounds from the constant worry. The hysteria that was being displayed was causing not only the town to have difficulty operating from day to day, but law enforcement were also experiencing issues with the case due to the frequent phone calls that they had to report about possible sightings of strange people in the area. Due to this, local police joined forces with the Illinois State Police, and at one point a total of 30 detectives were working on this case full time. Throughout the initial investigation, over 100 people were interviewed, and police actually arrested one person that they liked for it. However, the man was quickly released as he had an alibi that he could prove. Investigators didn't stop there. Practically everyone that Keith and Elaine worked with were questioned. The family's finances and personal lives were picked apart to see if there was anything that could have been the trigger. But regardless of what was looked into, nothing turned up as a possible motive. Neither Keith nor Elaine were unhappy, neither were having an affair, and their financial problems, while existent, were nothing to lead to a crime such as this. When the home was searched, nothing of note was found, with the exception of a very small amount of marijuana. While investigators wondered if this belonged to the Dardeens, many in the family denied that neither Keith or Elaine smoked. Another troubling fact was that nothing in the house had been taken. Money, jewelry, and electronics that could have easily been stolen were all left in place, eliminating a robbery theory which honestly worried the police even more. That someone or a group of people would inflict this much destruction on a family for the sole purpose of sick enjoyment. There was as well no sign of forced entry, and Elaine herself had not been physically assaulted, so that possible motive was also thrown out. What did stand out, though, was that it was obvious whoever committed this crime didn't feel like they were in a rush. They had taken time to clean up the scene as well as position Elaine, Peter, and Elaine's daughter in the bed. It was later learned that Elaine, Peter, and Elaine's daughter had been dead for around 12 hours. However, Keith had been dead for around 24 to 36 hours. Granted, he was found later in the afternoon, but it leads to a theory that I will come back to in a little bit. So, police were left looking at an incredibly violent attack on this family where nothing was taken. The crime was not financially or sexually motivated, and they knew they had time to clean up the scene. Another thing is that the weapon that was used was a baseball bat that actually belonged to Peter that was a gift from Keith, which tells me that even though Keith had been shot, none of the other family members were, making it seem like whoever was responsible showed up with only a gun, but instead of use that, they decided to take their time with a blunt baseball bat, leading many to feel that what drove this crime was purely for a thrill killing. Sadly, and unbelievably, little progress was made in this case. The mother of Keith, Joanne Dardeen, went to great lengths to get justice for her family and seemed to hit every roadblock imaginable. One being that she attempted to go on the Oprah Winfrey Show, but she was turned down due to the crime being too violent to mention on cable. She also had to sit and watch as more and more detectives were pulled from this case as it grew colder and resources had to be used elsewhere. Joanne was able to get the case covered on America's Most Wanted, but unfortunately, no new leads were formed from this. It shockingly appeared that this case was going to go on without any possible leads being formed. That was until in 2000, when serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells was awaiting trial for the murder of a girl in Texas, that he began confessing to other crimes, one being that he was responsible for the deaths of the Dardeen family. However, as promising as this sounded at first, it quickly became riddled with issues, as you will soon learn. It began with Sells saying that he was train hopping and ended up in Ina. While there, he ran into Keith at a bar, and Keith invited him over for dinner. And while there, made advances on Sells, and he reacted by killing Keith and then the rest of his family due to them being witnesses. The problem with that version of events was that to everyone who knew Keith, he was straight. And while sure, he could have kept that a secret, I highly doubt he would have propositioned cells in the home where his wife and son were also at. It also doesn't add up that Keith just invited this random man to his home when nights before the crime happened, he refused to let a young woman into his house to use their phone. Cells blamed the violence of the attack on uncontrollable rage. Cells would later change his story. This is a reoccurring theme with him, to him seeing that the Dardeens' home had a for sale sign in front of it and decided simply that he would wait until night and then murder them. He claimed the reason for doing this was because he wanted to steal their car. But when police questioned on the brutality of the killings, he simply claimed that it was due to them being witnesses. Something that police didn't fully believe, as there were far quicker means to get rid of them rather than taking the approach that he claims he did. The troubling thing, however, with Cells was that he was mentioning information about the crime that wasn't made public, which yes, made him at least a suspect, but with his conflicting and changing stories, as well as including a lot of information that had been made public, made it very hard to determine his guilt. Another problem was that Cells was in Texas, and Texas authorities refused to allow Cells to be transported to Illinois for questioning and seeing how well he actually knew the area. With Texas authorities not willing to allow this, the charges against Cells were never filed.
They are the last images of the Dardeen family.
One sadistic crime Cells confessed to shows the callous, unemotional disregard for human life typical of psychopaths. A 30-year-old mother, 7.5 months pregnant at home with her 3-year-old son, both bludgeoned to death.
What are you thinking and feeling when you kill someone?
It's just like that drug. I'm after that drug again. I don't have an on and off switch. I'm just after that drug. I'm after that feeling.
You could just tell me what happened as you were killing her. Did she give birth to a baby?
You know, you're pushing your luck.
I'm sorry.
Let's not get into blood and guts, because that's what you're trying to get into.
One other detail about Cells that seems suspicious is that he often claimed that he had been provoked during his crimes, making it appear as if he was always the victim and was simply defending himself. Something he did with his recounting of the Dardeen family. Overall, the theory of Cells being the one involved and responsible for the Dardeen crime is enough for some residents around the area of Ina, including law enforcement. Whereas others, including Joanne Dardeen, don't believe Cells to be the one responsible. There, of course, are other theories, ranging from it being a satanic cult to another serial killer named Angel Resendez. But many of those possible theories were eventually dismissed by law enforcement due to a lack of evidence. My own theory on the matter is something I weighed heavily on even including. When you are dealing with a crime this vicious and cruel, adding on top of that it remains unsolved, the last thing that I want to do is insult the families of the victims with some asinine theory. So I will briefly say this. To me, I feel that there were multiple perpetrators involved. I feel Keith was taken out of the home and met with his fate hours before the rest of the family was harmed. I think one person took Keith to the field, while another person watched over the family to make sure that they didn't call the police. I feel that they knew a family was in the home, and they eliminated the male first as he posed the biggest threat. All that was left was a very pregnant Eileen and 3-year-old Peter, which would be why those responsible didn't rush. They had time to do what they wanted and had hours before they needed to leave. I think that it was a surprise attack as well. The fact that no forced entry was made leads me to think that it could have been something as simple as Keith taking out the trash, where he was then ambushed and taken inside the home. Again, I know that I am probably missing details here, but the truth is, with the lack of anything being stolen and no clues left behind, and that the baseball bat that was Peter's was used as the weapon, tells me that even though they clearly had firearms, they instead opted for something that wasn't only more brutal, but was something that couldn't be tied back to them. Regardless of my theory or any other theory on this case, what is known is that on November 7th, 1987, a crime was committed that was so horrible that it seemed to forever alter the town that it happened in.